Really delighted that we've been joined this morning by Professor Laura Lundy, who is going to talk to us about enabling effective participation of children and young people in public policy and decision making. Before that, we're going to hear from Kula, the Commissioner for Children and Young People, who's going to set the scene really by describing the context for the participation of children and young people, including how meaningful and effective participation has created positive results elsewhere. And I suppose actually just something I read this morning to sort of put the importance of this in a political context. I just saw the latest polling in Scotland on independence shows that amongst 16 to 24-year-olds, 79% now favour independence. So there's a suggestion that somebody has not been, on the unionist side, has not been engaging effectively with young people. But anyway, before handing over to Kula, just a few points on how the session will run. Laura will present for approximately 30 plus minutes, and our slides will be circulated to you after the session. We'll have a Q&A after that, and I would encourage people to use the chat function or the blue hand, or just sort of wave your hands vigorously, and I'm sure somebody will notice you. If you're having any problems with your connection, it's probably worth disabling your video feed just to create extra bandwidth. And if you have any really difficult technical problems, then Pamela should hopefully be able to help you. Just finally to note, we're recording this session and we will be making it available on the CEF website afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my good friend Kula to set the scene.
Thanks a lot. So David, firstly I want to congratulate you on your recent honour and just say how very well deserved. I'm assuming you're not insisting that all members of the Chief Executives Forum curtsy when they talk to you, but I'll leave you to sort that out for yourselves. But congratulations.
Thank you very much, and I will be David from now on. Although if things do cut up rough, I will be looking for some due deference.
Good luck with that. So firstly, thank you very much for the invitation and what an absolute pleasure it is to be here. Normally I get quite stroppy when I'm asked to be the warm-up event for anybody, but when we're talking about this subject and we're talking about me being the warm-up event for Professor Lundy, then it's an absolute honour and pleasure. And I know you're not really here to hear me, so I am going to be brief. So just, you know who I am. I'm your Commissioner for Children and Young People, and Nikki's role is to promote and safeguard the rights and best interests of children and young people. For children and young people across Northern Ireland. Mairead McCafferty, our Chief Executive, who's also in the meeting today, is our chief, like I said, is our Chief Executive and is a member of the board of the Chief Executives Forum. So, we get everywhere, as is absolutely right, because children are everywhere. So what I want to do is just, by way of introduction, talk about the legislative and policy basis for engaging with children and young people and listening to their voice. And there's three particular instruments that I want to draw on. Firstly, I'm just trying to see if you can see this, because the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, available from all good bookshops. Which the UK government, as you know, have signed up to. And it outlines 42 rights that children are entitled to and that government have a responsibility to fulfill. And although no one right supersedes another, there are 4 principles which are the writing in the UNCRC rights rot. And these are Article 2, where a child has a right not to be discriminated. Article, David, can I ask everyone to switch your microphone off if that's possible? Thank you. Article 3, that a child's best interest must be the paramount consideration in all decisions and actions. Article 6, the right to life, survival and development. And finally, to the topic of our conversation today, Article 12. The convention says outlines that a child has a right to freely and fully express their views in all matters concerning them, whether they be big or small. And it's really important that we remember that in all our work that we undertake with children and young people, whether at policy level or individual child level. We then move on to Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act, which again, I don't need to explain to this audience. And as you know, outlines 9 categories of the population, including age, whose needs and experience have to be given particular consideration when devising policies. And then we get to the most recent piece of legislation that we think is significant, which is the Children's Services Cooperation Act, sometimes called Stephen Agnew's Private Members Bill, but it's actually the Children's Services Cooperation Act and was passed in 2015 by our Assembly. And this outlines 8 wellbeing outcomes, including the importance for enabling children to make a positive contribution to their society and ensuring that they live in a society which respects their rights. So there we have the framework, the legislative framework that tells us that we have to absolutely engage meaningfully with our children and young people. But even if we didn't have that, we know it's the right thing to do. Do you know, I can't imagine in any other place how anyone can think it's effective to do something, to make decisions about someone's life without engaging them. And here in Northern Ireland, as David's alluded to, we do have pockets of excellent practice. We can see work going on in the councils to the beginning of shadow youth councils. In our assembly, there's been a recent announcement that we're going to have a youth assembly. We can see pockets, and I know there are people here from health trusts and in education. We can see pockets of really amazing practice where young people have their voices heard in the services that they are involved with. And we have had some very, very well-meaning starts. But in my view, involvement of young people in decision-making here has been characterised by inconsistency and a lack of proper support, training and investment. And to a certain extent, this has resulted in a lack of confidence. But as I've said, I genuinely believe that all this is changing. And some of that change has been driven by young people who have most definitely found their campaigning voice on particular issues in recent years. They've told us they want change when it comes to the climate, when it comes to mental health, when it comes to road safety, and more recently, they have articulated their views on the exam crisis. But there's a range of other issues, and many of you will know them locally. A young woman recently said to Nikki, how can it be that there are still governments in countries that are made up of adults who ignore the best interests of children when they are making laws and decisions? What hope do they have for the future of their country, for the future of our planet, for the future of humanity, if they seek to ignore the needs and wishes of children in their care? I ask you this question, and with respect, I expect you to listen. I may be a child, I may be small, but I know that I have a voice, and my voice matters. So the question is, how do we make that voice matters? How do we move into a meaningful implementation mode? Again, as many of you know, the Children and Young People Strategy, which is mandated by the Children's Services Cooperation Act, and will also act as the National Action Plan for the implementation of the UNCRC, is due to be signed off by the Northern Ireland Executive imminently, she says with a wry smile on her face, wry smile. We're hoping it will happen soon. There will then be a formalised process of implementation across government and their agencies. One of the supporting mechanisms for the strategy is the participation in decision-making project, which has been established by DE. The purpose of this project is to develop a Northern Ireland policy on participation, thereby ensuring that the voice of the child is heard and acted upon in every nook and cranny of our decision-making processes. It is tasked with identifying options and agreeing the most effective framework and structures. So when thinking of structures, we finally get to why we're here today. If we take it as a given that it's right that we ensure that young people can be active participants in our society and that they have a right to be involved in the decisions that drive that society forward, the next question is, how do we do that? Walking the walk, if you like. To inform next steps, we should of course examine international best practice and seek to apply it to our context. So whether you go to the UN, the EU or the Council of Europe, or anywhere else actually, you will find that one model is lauded over all others. The Lundy model of participation, and actually I will retire when I get a model named after me, but anyway, the Lundy model of participation is evidence-based and deeply rooted in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's also informed by the views of children and young people from across the world. It is used across the world, as I've said, as well as by our nearest neighbours. Professor Laura Lundy has a long and breathtaking CV and research background on a range of issues concerning children and young people. She is, as I have said, not a, but the world authority on effective participation with children and young people. And she is one of our own, or one of your own. As you know, I'm not from Northern Ireland. She's born and bred in Belfast. So there's no need for us to go too far to find the best in the world on this issue. So we know what we have to do, and we know we have to get on and do it. And what Laura will hopefully, well, I actually know what she'll do, is tell us the how. We shouldn't be scared of it. Children and young people will not condemn us for trying. They'll only condemn us for not caring. So over to you.
Over to me.
Over to you. Over to you. Sorry, I don't know who, over to you, Laura.
Back to Sir David or me? Me. Okay, thank you very much, Cilla, and thank you, Sir David, and thank you to the Chief Executives Forum for the opportunity to present to you today, and thank you to Pamela for keeping me right and getting me set up. I'm going to share my screen now. And what I'm going to do is 3 things, hopefully within 30 minutes, so that we have time for questions, because I am really curious to hear all of the good things that are going on here at home. I'm going to start by briefly outlining what the Lundy model is. I'm then going to show you some examples of it working in practice in other parts of the world primarily. And then if we have time, I'm going to take you through some myths and do a bit of myth busting about child participation with you. Cilla's really helpfully covered the first slide for me. She's outlined the fact that we both position our work within the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and very specifically this one provision, Article 12, which the UK government has ratified, and therefore the state and all state agents are bound to comply with. And that is, it's quite a complicated text. You can take a second and read it. We often revert to abbreviations, and I'm going to come to that. But it gives children, every child who's capable of forming a view, the right to express it freely in a matter affecting them, in all matters affecting them. But more than that, it then says that the child's views should be given due weight in accordance with the age and maturity of the child. Now, you'll never remember that text. I can just about do it now, and I'm going to come back to that. 2 quick points. Who does it apply to? Does it apply just to children? Does it apply to groups of children? And it's really clear now from the Committee on the Rights of the Child that it's a right of individual children. So if a child is having a decision made about them, their education, their care, their custody, anything, then they have a right to be heard on that individual decision. But I think this is what primarily I think will interest many of you. It's also a right of groups of children. So if decisions are being made about laws or about policies and practices that affect children as a category or as a group, they are also entitled to be heard. What does it apply to? The text says it applies to all matters affecting the child, and that's been interpreted really broadly. It's not just issues to do with children specifically. So we know, of course, it's going to apply to issues like education, and it's going to apply to issues like play or care and custody for children. But it also applies to other decisions that impact on children as well as adults. So it can apply to things like transport and to planning. And again, I'll come back to that. My journey started actually in Cilla's office whenever the office was first set up in 2003. And I was asked to lead a team of researchers that looked at children's experiences of their rights in Northern Ireland. And actually was quite a significant thing for me. Until that point, I actually was pretty cynical about child participation. And I don't always admit that, but I'll admit it at home. I'd been actually part of the drafting committee for the Bill of Rights, the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. And I used to get a bit cynical whenever the children's rights advocates would go, what about the views of the child? And I used to do a bit of an inward, sometimes an outward eye roll. I just didn't get it at that point in time. And what happened at that then was that I became the principal investigator in this study for the Children's Commissioner. And because it was the Children's Commissioner, we were told that we had to talk to children. And I knew I had to do it because that was the grant that we'd gone for, but I didn't do it myself. I had 3 fantastic researchers, and they used to go and talk to children right across Northern Ireland, eventually over 1,000 children, asking them about their lives. Because I thought it was a better use of my time, with others, talked to the professionals. I talked to teachers and social workers and doctors and lawyers about children. and something strange happened. So I'm a lawyer by background, and I was working with the legal text of Article 12, which is the text that I had up for you. I was talking to adults, and when I was saying to them, well, what about Article 12? The professionals in Northern Ireland were saying, what about it? What is it? They hadn't heard of it. And then I would say it's about listening to children and giving their views due weight. And they would say, oh, yeah, of course, yeah, we do that. We do that. We do the voice of the child. Child voice is really important to us, or pupil voice or student voice, but this term voice. Meanwhile, my researchers were coming back to my office at Queen's daily and showing me what children were saying. And what children and young people were saying right across every aspect of their lives in Northern Ireland was that they were frustrated because either their views were not sought, or their views were sought, but they were dismissed, or worse than dismissed, that actually they were considered to somehow being challenging authority or being cheeky or whatever. So we had this disconnect between the law, what children were experiencing, and what adults thought they were doing. And it's captured in this particular picture that was one of the ones that we used in the study that was drawn by a child in the context of family life. And you can see the mum, pretty clear it's the mum, is saying, you shouldn't be telling me what to do. And the boy is saying, I was just telling you what I think. You can see that when children were expressing themselves in lots of contexts, adults were thinking, oh, they're challenging us, as opposed to going, what's going on here? What should we be listening to? So that's a boy not getting a say in a conversation. And that changed everything for me, because it became really clear to me reading that data that I was wrong, that I got it wrong, that these children actually were expressing things about their lives that adults didn't see, understand, and should be dealing with. So what happened then was I started to think about this notion of voice, and it became clear to me that it wasn't really helpful, nor were other abbreviations of this complex legal provision, like the right to be heard or the right to have a say. And I concluded that each of them was an imperfect summary of this important human rights protection, and that it could potentially undermine its implementation. And I suggested, and this was an academic article, I didn't realize I was going to end up here at the time. It was an academic article published in 2007. And I said that if we were to fully implement this human right, we've got to go beyond voice. Voice is not enough. And I suggested that not just voice, that we need space, voice, audience, and influence. And not only do we need these four, we need to understand them beyond this provision of Article 12. All human rights are indivisible, interrelated, and interdependent. And in this one, you can't implement a rights-based effective approach to participation unless you consider the other aspects of the convention, some of which Kul has already mentioned, like the best interest principle, but also the right to be safe and the right, which is important, to advice and guidance from parents. So the basic elements of the model are this: space, children are given the opportunity; voice, they're facilitated to form and express views; audience, they're listened to; and influence, it's acted upon. And I'm going to really briefly just take you through each of those concepts, and then that will be the first part over. So in terms of space, the legal obligation is to assure this to the child, which is actually a very strong term in human rights treaty. And this means that it needs to be actively created. We're not supposed to just wait until children come and tell us what they think. It's an obligation on us, you as duty bearers, to go and actively seek out children's views using whatever mechanisms are available and possible for you. It needs to be a safe space, not just one where children are comfortable, but a space where they are able to speak without fear of rebuke or reprisal. And we know that children are often worried about saying what they think because they're worried about what the reaction to that would be. And crucially, and I know you will get this, that it needs to be an inclusive space. The right is a right of all children. And that means that we have to create ways in which all children have access to opportunities to say what they think. You know, whether that's a young child, a child with a disability, a child from an ethnic minority, it needs to be inclusive. Oh, I jumped on the important one. Voice, the right to express a view freely. That's the text of the convention. Crucially, I said this at this time, but people didn't realize it's a right and not a duty. You know, all of us can reject our human rights. We don't have to have them. And likewise, children don't have to speak. You know, it's not that they shouldn't be forced to speak. It's an opportunity to say what they think, not a requirement. Although I want to put a little rider on that, and that is that we're really clear from our own research that sometimes silence is voice. Sometimes the not talking is the talking, and it's really important that we know that. There must be choice in the mode of expression. You know, children don't all want to communicate the same way, nor do we. mean, there's a lot of assumptions that, that when we do participation and we get children, that you throw out markers and colouring pens because children love to draw. I wonder how many of you loved to draw when you were small. Lots of us hated to draw, we're really bad at it. And it's the same with children. We need options for these children when we give them possibilities to be included in our conversations. It's afforded to all children who are capable of forming a view, and that is really crucial. Is that I think there's an assumption the first part of the right is only qualified by capable of forming a view, not age and maturity. And what we know in practice is that a lot of decisions are made where it's decided children are too young or too immature. And so we don't include them from the outset. That's not our decision. The right is that the child is capable of forming a view, they're entitled to express it. And then we get on to the obligation after that, which is now. Audience. Views of the child being given due weight. These second two concepts were the things I think that changed people's thinking, because there's a lot of activity where children are taking part, but taking part is not a rights-based, meaningful approach to participation. Participation in Article 12 is participation with purpose, and the purpose is to affect the decisions to influence the decisions that affect children. It's to have an impact on those, and if they're going to have an impact, there needs to be somebody listening to them who has the power to affect change. So crucially, it's more than the right to be heard, it's the right to need to be actively listened to. But it's really important when we engage in this process that we're identifying the right people. Who should children's views be going to? Who is that person? Do they actually have power in this area? Or are they just there in some kind of, it's not counselling, not to let the children just say what they think because they'll feel better if they get it out of their systems. It's participation with purpose. So sometimes that needs formal channels of communication. A good example of that would be school councils. If you have a school council, where are the views of the school council going? Are they going right up to the Board of Governors? Are children on the Board of Governors? Because that's where decisions are going to be made. And if that's where they're being made, children's views need to reach that, and we need ways of ensuring that they do. And finally, influence, which is the Holy Grail. Children's views should be given due weight in accordance with the age and maturity of the child. The way that we react to that procedurally is ensuring a formal response, and crucially, they should be given feedback about the extent of influence they had. So back when the article was published, I said we've got to create the conditions where it's uncomfortable for adults to solicit children's views and then ignore them. I mean, that still happens a lot where children are really involved, but there's no response back to them telling them what happened. And at the very end of this talk, I'm going to give you where I'm positioned at the minute, some new work on really bolstering feedback as a way of ensuring influence. Okay, that's a really brief introduction to the Lundy model. Okay, what I'm going to do now is show you some of it in practice, which I think is probably what you'll be interested in. So its appeal at the time, again, when you write these academic articles, you're kind of hoping that, you get maybe 6 people reading them, and usually I always find that one of those people is my mum, and she may have read it 5 times, but this particular article did not run like that. It went the academic, and I think probably the practice equivalent of viral. So it fascinates me why it did. I was at the time in the very end sentence, I think I said, I want to do something that is legally sound and user friendly. I want people to understand the right, but I want to something that they can then put it into practice. And I thought, that's it. I'll get a few citations, do my job. But it's not the way it worked. And in some ways it has changed my whole kind of career, and actually my life in some respects. What it does is it captures the qualities of rights-based participation rather than different levels or forms. And I'll come back to that. My model landed in a sea of models. And then all the other models emphasize a hierarchy where you're constantly trying to get children to the top of a ladder, which I'll show you. And that's wrong from a rights-based perspective. That's wrong. Giving children the right to make their own decisions and not have adult influence could be an absolute breach of their rights. We don't necessarily want them at the top of the ladder. We want the right level of input for the decision, the context, and the child. So what my model does is captures those qualities of rights-based participation wherever we're at and whatever decision. And these concepts are fluid and allow people to apply them. They've done. So eventually it has kind of been picked up. I'm only going to give you a snapshot of some of the things I think will interest you. Clearly the large children's rights organizations in the world would use it. I mean, it's something that really is core to their work, and it's used by UNICEF now across its work, and it's used by many other international children's organizations like World Vision. the most comprehensive use of it, and I'm so pleased the Department of Education here is looking at this as our strategy, is Ireland. So our neighbour, they have a Department of Children and Youth Affairs, and in 2015, they agreed their national strategy on child and youth participation, and they adopted my model in it. And what they asked me to do back then was to work with people from, like yourselves, from every government department in Ireland and all of the major agencies to put it into practice. And with that group, in about 2013, I think it was, or 14, we came up with this checklist, which was a really kind of easy way of asking some core questions that would prompt good thinking about putting the child's right to be heard into practice. So you can see that, and we can certainly share that version. I have to say, I spent a lot of lockdown on two projects. One is for the UN, and one is here on the Irish National Strategy. They're about to produce a national framework on child participation, again, based on the model. And we have produced a new checklist, and we have consulted across every government department and agency. And it turns out we now have lots of checklists. We have an everyday checklist, and we have a checklist for schools, for social workers, for youth workers, for early childhood. And we have a planning checklist, an evaluation checklist, and we have checklists for children. They're going to be launched next month. They did say I could share them with you today, but I think I've got enough to say. So if anybody wants them, I can share. So this is the checklist we produced back then. Then this checklist took a life of its own and got adopted by the European Commission. I'll come back to that. They are checklists. I think it's interesting. We're in the process of our strategy. I'm sure many of you are talking to people, your partners in the south of Ireland. They have this midterm review, and I think it just wanted to give you a snapshot of the different ways and the different agencies that have actions under the midterm review. So it started quite small, and now it's really quite massive. I mean, there's not a public body in Ireland that isn't doing something or promising to do something. What has happened since then is lots of the agencies have adopted their own strategies. The biggest one, an early adopter, was TISLA, their Child and Family Agency, which uses the Lundy model and has trained all social work staff on it. And they've got some really good guidance. They do it better than I do. I'm particularly proud of the Oberstown campus. I worked with them, that's their detention centre. And I worked with them, their staff, and the young men in Oberstown to produce a youth participation strategy for it. So they have their own, but you get things like Swim Ireland has its own strategy based on the Lundy model, the GAA. There are lots and lots of agencies that have adopted it and made it their own. This is another example of the Irish checklist being used by somebody else. In this case, the World Health Organization has adopted the Lundy model. They've used it a wee bit oddly. Oh, this is being recorded, oops. And that is that they're using to show examples of space, voice, audience, or influence. And I mean, I think it's really lovely that they've done that, but I think, you've got to do all four, and I think it's nice to see examples of bits of it, but the whole point is like, do it all. Today's quite a special day, I think, for me, because there are many city councils across the world have adopted, and I have been working very happily with Belfast City Council, which is great to do something at home. But today, Leicester City Council is publishing, I'm sure my Twitter's going mad, their own strategy for the council, which is then going to be adopted in the county. And they've really gone for the model, and they've produced incredible resources and a new strategy that's coming today, which is great. And you can see they've added their own. People do this, which I love. They have space, voice, audience, influence, and then impact. Now, influence is impact, but I think it's really nice. They want you to know how your ideas will make a difference. And somebody else suggested that should be response as a fifth element to the model. I wanted to share this because I only got it yesterday, and I've got permission from Tash, who is a young care experienced girl from Leicester, who is launching in Leicester today. And I got sent her speech, and her speech is all about the Lundy model and the difference. And I was, blown away. I mean, I see lots of stuff like this, and I shouldn't be so cynical, but this one genuinely got to me. And there were a few things that she said that really stood out, about audience being not just the ability to communicate ideas, but someone making a difference. I can't read it all because some of your faces are over it, which is lovely. But this is a really important thing that people don't always get in the influence bit. Influence is not always seeing change, but knowing why things may not be able to change. So important that's communicated regardless of the outcome. So you were able to have your say, even if the ability of some influence is so powerful. And she gets you need the 4 bits despite all these stages being separate, they're inextricably linked. To be able to satisfy one is the ability to eventually satisfy all. So just because I got it yesterday, and she's probably presenting it as we speak, but I wanted to share it with you, and she's given me permission to share it. Governance is obviously another area. We talked about children being involved in the strategic level. A really good person to talk about that, Kula and Mairead, because clearly within the Children's Commissioner's Office, children are really involved at the strategic level. They have their own children's panel. Kula was appointed in a process that involved being interviewed by children. I've been advising a lot of organisations across the world about involving children in governance, and there are lots of different ways to do that. It has to be right for the organisation. Some of them have a parallel body, some of them have them integrated on main bodies. It just depends. This past year, we've been working with BBC Children in Need on one of their new programmes, A Million in Me, which is about mental health. And that's been really helpful. And there's a document that we've produced that I'm sure they would be happy to share, a guide to involving children in advisory groups and panels. And in that panel, which we piloted in Scotland for the organisation as a whole, the children have been involved in rewriting principles, designing evaluation forms, just all sorts of ways. And then hopefully whenever COVID moves on, we'll get back up and running with that group more fully. So that's just some examples. That's the second part of the talk. I want to absolutely emphasize there is no one right way, and don't let anybody tell you there is. You know, my concepts help you think about what is the right way for you. It depends, as I said before, on the child, the context, and the decision. And I mean, I was really pleased to see John McCrae coming in. I couldn't be happier or more excited that we're getting a Northern Ireland Youth Assembly finally. And again, as John said to me, we had to do it our way. And I mean, other countries have approached that differently. They've had something outside their body or inside their body. What we're doing has to be right for us and for the children and young people involved. That's the second part of the talk. How am I doing for time? Have I? Well, you want to stop me when I'm going to go into myths, so I'll just keep going until you stop me then. Okay, myths. I think this is if I have a chance to do it. I over these years, as I've talked, and I've spent a lot of time advising other governments on this. And as you go along, you hear these things that are put to you, and I want to put a few of them to you that I think are things that are said about child and youth participation that aren't true. But I have a caveat before I start, and that is that I heard one time that whenever somebody says, I'm going to tell you the myths, what people do is they only remember the myth. They don't remember that it is a myth, you know? So I'm going to say to you, don't do that, okay? These are wrong. If I'm saying them, it's because I don't agree with them, they're wrong. So I maybe need to change from myths. Here's one, a local one. The first one is that adults know best, you know, and that's, I mean, this was put to me in the New Zealand equivalent of Newsnight in January. I couldn't believe someone would do that. But people say this, Professor Lundy, do adults know best? And the answer to that is adults know a lot, but adults do not always know best because they don't know what children experience and they don't know what children feel. And here's an example from Northern Ireland that has never changed. And it came from that very, very original Commissioner study. And this bus is a yellow school bus. Now, who uses yellow school buses in Northern Ireland? They're only used for some children, and they're only used for children going to special schools. Why are they yellow? Because obviously adults were thinking these are children who go to special schools, they've got learning difficulties, and these will keep them safe. Everyone will know it's the children with the learning difficulties, so they'll take extra care around the bus. That's a perfectly legitimate explanation for a yellow bus. We talked to children in special schools back in 2003 and 2004. They said, we hit that bus. We hit that bus. That's the custard bus. That's the banana bus. We're so embarrassed to be on that bus because everybody knows we're on our way to the special school. We hide under the seats, okay? So adults do not see or think or feel what children feel. On the other hand, on the other side of the coin, you hear this phrase, children are the experts in their own lives. That's just not true either. That's not true. Children have expertise in their own lives and they're experts in their own feelings. I think that's a rider to that. But they're not the experts. There are many people who have expertise in children's lives and it's not children instead of them, and that we need to enable the experts, the people who have trained and understand things that children cannot see, that they have expertise too. And the point about participation is getting people in a dialogue so everything is understood, okay? Crucially, it undermines adults' authority, that what we're doing when we do this is we hand decision making over to children. That's just not true either. That's just nonsense. You know, that's not what the article says. It's to give children's due weight in accordance with age and maturity. And children should never be allowed to opt out of things that will, irreparably damage their life chances. Higher is better. I touched on this earlier on. The big rival for my model is Hart's ladder participation. I mean, and Roger Hart, who designed this, never intended this to happen. But lots of people use this ladder participation thinking, we've got to get up the steps, we've got to get up the steps, we've got to have child-led decision making. And I said before, that's wrong. A child-led decision might be a breach of their rights, a decision an adult should take, but talking to the child. It depends, you have to pick the right step for the ladder, and not to assume that it's all, obviously the more that we can involve children, the better. We want to do it as fully as possible. I'm not saying that, but it's not necessarily at the top. They're too young. I think I mentioned that earlier. The right is every child who's capable of forming a view. And we know from our research that even very young children are incapable of communicating how they feel. And I find it funny that lots of adults, whenever they want to express a really powerful emotion, use a baby meme, and they use a baby meme because babies are actually so expressive, and we know often what they think just by their face. And, so listening to children doesn't always involve listening. Sometimes it involves looking, it involves observing, and there's lots of great practice across the world in involving very young children, babies, neonates in decision making. Well, we'll come back to that. Sometimes one of the big criticisms is they're not representative. I hear this all the time in terms of youth councils, student councils, everybody, people asking, who are these children? They're a certain type. There's all that criticism, and I worry about that because I think it's often done to undermine the value of those children's input. So the first issue is every single child has a right to be heard. So even if they are the pick of the crop and who's doing it for their CV, or they're only there for the pizza, they're still a child that's entitled to be heard. Now, clearly the answer to this is not to criticize those children, but it's to work to make sure that we have inclusive, that we get children who are not on it. We go out of our way to make sure there's active recruitment of others. But I always think it's funny whenever, this is obviously the Westminster Parliament. And if you look at it, you think, well, is that representative? Of course, it's part of our democracy. It represents us to a point, but you might not find it fully representative of everybody in the United Kingdom. And actually, I feel that with the Committee on the Rights of the Child, who will say, are they representative? And I think, well, are you? So I think we've got to be less, we've got to work towards being more fully representative without criticising what we've got. I'm nearly there. It would take too much time, it cost too much money. I don't think anybody should say that, but I think sometimes, clearly child participation, youth participation takes some time, it takes some thought, but it doesn't always take all of the time and all of the thought that people suggest. That there are sometimes very quick, prompt ways in which we can engage with children. I don't know if any of you've ever seen this thing. I think it comes from management speak, which is, you would guess, is really not my world. But this is this idea that if you're doing anything in life, you can only do two of these. You can only be good and fast, or good and cheap, or fast and cheap, but you can never be all three. I don't know if anybody's ever seen it, but I saw this in a newspaper one Sunday, and I thought, that's child and youth participation. We're always asked to be good and fast and cheap. Is it always impossible? Which two do we choose? These are the kinds of questions you ask yourself. And actually, when I've gone across the world, I always ask for examples, and I'd love it if you could give me some examples. When you've been really good means that you're complying with the principles in my model, you're rights respecting. Fast means that you're doing it promptly because children grow up and we can't take our time really. And that cheap meaning cost effective, that it doesn't always require, this whole battery of creative methods. I'll give you a really good example from a school in Northern Ireland, and that is a head teacher appointed to school, goes in the first day, goes into the whole school assembly, hands out post-it notes and says to every child in school, one colour post-it note, write something you really like about school, other post-it, write something you would change. And they put them on the two walls, and then she gathered them. Nobody knew who anybody was, and she said she never got a better feel for walking into a school. Cost post-its, what do they cost? Finally, it would be tokenistic. This is where my current work is. A lot of people are, as an excuse for not involving children, will say, oh, it would be tokenistic. And what they want there is some kind of badge or medal for not listening to children. It's almost like it's a good excuse. And I'm very concerned about that. You clearly don't want to be tokenistic, but we can't use tokenism as an excuse. There is no other human right that we have that it would be okay to say, I can't do this really well, so I'm not going to do it at all. I can't give you a good education, so you're getting none. I can't give you a good access to healthcare, so you're getting none. It just doesn't work like that. You know, you've got to start. And I want to reassure anybody who's thinking of starting or has started and feels it's not good enough, it's always imperfect. No matter when you engage with children, you could always do it a bit better. There'd be more children, more money, more time, more whatever. But, you know, like, don't let, you know, perfection be the enemy of progress. We've got to do something. And sometimes tokenism is that start on this journey. And children, adults learn. And we've seen that. I've seen that in Northern Ireland. Children, if they get reaction to tokenistic behavior, sometimes at school councils, they get disaffected and go, I'm not bothering with that. But our research globally shows that more times than not, they get frustrated and go, well, I'm not taking that. And I'm going to come back and try it this way, or we're going to do that, or we're going to try another thing. So I think don't be saying, because we can do nothing, we're not doing anything at all. It's not our entitlement. This is a right of the child and not our gift. It's not the gift of adults. So what can we do? This is where my work is now. We're trying to make meaningful engagement a meaningful term. I said to you, I settled on feedback. And where I am now, last slide, is that I think that feedback is this critical juncture in the participation relationship, the dialogue between children and the adults who are making decisions about them. And what often happens is that we take children's views and we make a decision. And if we communicate back at all, we communicate in a very bland way that really does not give children a sense of what happened. And I'm encouraging everyone, including myself and my whole centre in our work, is that when children take the time to give us their views, that we respond to them more fully. We ask ourselves these questions. What first one's ungrammatical? What did you agree with? Is it grammatical? What did you agree with what I said? What has surprised you? You know, what has it influenced your views? What did you disagree with? Crucially, if you disagreed, really important, why? And what's the reasoning for that? Just to explain it. And what are you going to do? What have you decided? What happens next? So that's me. That's the Lundy model. That's some examples of it in practice. And hopefully that's some myth busting. And I'd be really excited to hear what you're up to or any questions you have. Thank you very much.
And on behalf of the forum, Laura, I want to thank you very much for that, and to thank the Commissioner as well for that introduction to today's session, and that really powerful parting comment that you left with us, that children and young people will only condemn us for not caring. Laura, a real tour de force there from a true world authority on this issue, and thank you very much for your time today. It's a really thought-provoking presentation, and essentially an excellent insight into the practicalities for all of us in mainstreaming the responsibilities that we have as public authorities, and the real reassurance there towards the end about starting the journey and not letting perfection be the enemy of good. And I think the importance of this issue to our members is really highlighted by the breadth of organisations represented on today's session. So I would like to throw the floor open at this point to anyone who has any particular issues they want to explore further with Laura, or any comments or reflection on the presentation. It's not high tech. If anyone wants to wave or to use your wave emoji at the bottom of the screen there, if you want to get involved. I'm looking through screens at the minute. I'm not seeing anyone. I would, oh, Teresa Fallon there. We'll just unmute you. Sorry, Pamela.
Okay, thank you very much. And that was really an excellent presentation, and I'm delighted that I was able to be here to hear it. I'm one of the assistant directors in the Gala, and we're on a journey with children's participation and have been for about the last 3 years. And so many of the things that you said resonated very much with where we are. And I mean, the kind of comments you've made about, oh, it's tokenistic and people don't want it to be tokenism. And also sometimes the message that we hear doesn't necessarily go down very well. And we don't want to alienate our colleagues or even our own staff by the message some of the children we're working with, you know, are saying. And it's about how do we make sure that the audience can hear the message, even though it's very uncomfortable at times. And I think that's been one of the difficulties we've had. Indeed, I've had, you know, as well, in terms of trying to create the impact that we want it to have, rather than it being felt as very uncomfortable and a criticism. So I mean, that's been part of our experience. As well as that, we've had some excellent young people who have contributed to our forum and to our staff, policies like 10 top tips for judges, which we've shared with the judiciary, and expectations, what I expect from a guardian ad litem when they come to visit. So we've had some excellent inputs from children, which have had a massive impact on practice. Like, for example, we had a young woman talk to us about what it was like when she was reading her own files, and the impact on her of seeing how different her experience was to how the social worker or the guardian or whatever worker recorded it at the time. And that's had a massive impact on all of us who are social workers, that we're thinking about, well, somebody's going to read this, and it's had a massive impact. So we've had some excellent input and influence from children and young people, but at the same time, sometimes the message is quite uncomfortable, and we're still at that stage. So I just wanted to say lots of the stuff that you've said has resonated very much with the journey that we're on, and it's great to hear that there's no right way. It's just about doing it rather than not doing it. So thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. It's great to hear about the work in Nagala. I think you've raised a really important point about resistance. And I mean, there are always going to be adults in organizations who don't. I mean, I was one of those adults, so I think I get it better than most people. And I think in all human rights, and I don't want to give a lecture, but there are 3 ways in which you can, you know, implement them whenever people are resisting. One is coercion. You force them, you know, you can make it law, people start doing it and then they have to get on with it. So you can have a legal obligation to have a school council, and a school has to do it, and they mightn't do it very well, but they do it. Persuasion is this kind of training. And I also think pioneers, the people, when I see it across the world, it's this person who gets it, who takes it on board and then shows the value, is often the most effective thing. And they say that, and so people can't really resist this. The third one in human rights terms, a thing called acculturation. And acculturation is where people do it, but not because they're forced to, or not even because they're convinced to, but because everybody else is doing it, they don't want to look bad. And I think a lot of that goes on in child participation, and we better look like we've got a panel. And even acculturation can be that stepping stone, you know, into it, that dipping your toe and finding, actually, this isn't that bad, this isn't that hard, these children aren't that scary, whatever it is. So I don't really mind what gets us there, and it can be a bit of all that. Have as a legal requirement, have good training, you know, have good examples, and then make people feel bad. Do you know, I'm maybe making you feel a little bad about the south of Ireland, you know, it's peer pressure, you know, and it works in its own way. And I think use whatever strategy you can, or all 3.
Thank you for that, Laura. I think Lisa Higgins from DOJ. Lisa, had you wanted to come in?
No, hadn't said anything.
Sorry. Anyone else want to get involved in the Q&A then before we wrap up? And I've lost the screen, but no, back on. Yeah, David Sterling.
Let me unmute. No, look, a brilliant presentation, Laura, really thought-provoking. And this is, I see there are some colleagues from Department of Education and the Education Authority. And I guess one of the biggest issues that we're addressing, you know, collectively at the moment is the response to COVID. And one of the biggest issues within that is children attending school. And I'm sorry to put anybody in the Department of Education or the Education Authority on this spot, but just given the huge debate about the impact that being at school or being at home is having on our young people, and our particularly children of school age, and is this model, is the Lundy model being applied in that area in regard to helping to determine what is best for children at this particular time? And I'm sorry, Paul is looking straight in front of me here on the screen, but I'm not picking on you in particular, Paul.
Well, I was actually just thinking about what you were saying there, Dale. It was either actually, I suppose, myself or Siobhan from the Education Authority. I don't think she's really quite new to her post at the moment, but she works in youth services. She maybe want to come in this as well. There has been quite a bit of work done over the summer in terms of consulting with children and young people. The department and the minister were very keen that we would listen to children and young people as the Education Restart programme was advanced. College and Education Authority were Siobhan works and her colleagues were quite central in engaging with children and young people across a range of themes. Again, hearing about, I suppose, their concerns, their thoughts, their views about what would happen when we got back to sort of restart of education. Like Laura says, it hasn't been perfect what we've done. I think there's been quite a lot of learning from it. Things haven't maybe always been it's been done at pace, I suppose, and done at speed, a lot of the work. One of the things where there may be sort of gaps is providing feedback. We are going to be there is more work ongoing at the moment to engage with children and young people, to gain their views about their experiences of being back at school as well, because that's important. So yes, there's been a lot of work done. There's work ongoing, and we are listening. Have we fully applied the Lundy model? Maybe not, but as I said, it's been done at pace. And it has been done with the best of intentions in trying to involve children and young people in it, because obviously it's so important in terms of sort of their education, their mental health and well-being. You know, I know we have tried to provide feedback to children and young people as part of the process. But it has been patchy, I think, as well. But I think we will learn from it. I'm working on the project on participation and decision making for young people. So there's a lot of learning that we can get from this in terms of sort of how we move forward, and maybe how we change things in the future. We're working on a policy statement that goes along with this, so we'll be taking into account a lot of the things that have happened over the summer as well, to sort of think about sort of, you know, how we develop it, how we develop our options, how we implement, and I suppose, well, how we sort of build across the Northern public sector, taking into account the community sector, making sure that we involve everyone. It's there's a lot of work to be done here, I think, more than maybe we anticipated when we started our project, for sure. Hopefully that's helpful.
There's something on that, because it is interesting, you know, and we've just completed a global study, 27,000 children in 140 countries, and it's such an important issue, schooling, and wanting back safely. But in Northern Ireland, I think, you know, a really interesting thing happened in a kind of, you know, the department was doing stuff, and it was great to see the minister out in schools talking to children and young people. And I think it will be different whenever the Youth Assembly is up. There will be at least a structure for that. But meanwhile, we witnessed a child-led organisation. We witnessed the formation of the Secondary Schools Association for Northern Ireland. So a bunch of young people from right across Northern Ireland went, they're not talking to us, and they got themselves together, and you know, and you saw them all. They were all over social media about exams. I mean, I ended up in an informal, I can't even call it a trustee because we've got no legal basis, role with advising them. And today already they're saying to me, right, we don't like our school councils, we're going to do research on them, you know. So I think when we don't create the spaces, young people will increasingly watch the climate change movement. They're going to come in for us, you know. And I think it's much better that they have the audience that we need, the kind of formal recognition, so that we don't have to go find them. You know, they're there and they're waiting to tell us what they think. Yeah.
Laura, sorry, Laura, just to come back to you, just on it, I hadn't heard about this, and there's one of the things I think that's difficult sometimes is communication and information, you know, and being aware of this. So I'd be interested to hear a bit more about that, actually. You know,
they blow me away.
Right.
I mean, they're right across the whole school sector. I don't know how, you know, their social media got them together, and they've watched climate change, and they're the group. They're all mostly lower sixth and our GCSE year, so they're now on to, you know, the ASs. But previously they were working on the exam results. They're talking about back to school, safe return to school, and they're phenomenal. You know, they're really phenomenal. They're mirroring. There's associations like this all over Europe, and they're mirroring one, I think, based in Brussels.
Can I just ask something?
Yes.
I work along with Teresa, who was just speaking to you. I suppose one of the things that I'm always interested in is how to keep the young people, how to keep them involved, especially those young people who have maybe had a very difficult time, a lot of trauma, and can still be moving in the system and aren't quite settled. And I suppose that's something that I'm interested in, if anybody has any ideas of how you do that, how you just keep them with you, you know, through that very difficult period and keep that consistent.
Again, there's huge experience in Northern Ireland doing that. Coola herself, from her work in the past, Include Youth right now. There are organisations that are world experts on this. I mean, we've a couple of projects in the minute. We're working with Include Youth, who work with our most marginalised of young people. We've one led by Oxford on school exclusions. You know, so people, the children and young people whose lives are really disrupted. And when you want them to work with you, and they want to work with you, you have to work in ways that suit them, at times that suit them, on issues that interest them. And that they're unwilling if you kind of meet those criteria. And we do have a lot of local expertise. This is one area I think we're really good on.
Okay, thank you.
Could I maybe just come in if I'm allowed to?
Yeah, sorry.
Siobhan Byrne from Youth Service Education Authority. Just to say we're working very closely with Paul and with June Wilkinson. And obviously the whole participation for us in youth services is, I suppose, the most important element, because youth workers, I suppose, work through the participation model in the work they do anyway. And they're constantly involving young people in decision making and constantly working with young people and encouraging their participation. But we're working very hard at the minute, particularly for our directorate as well, on a programme called My Voice, where each week, well, we did the stuff in August, as Paul said, and now each week we're continuing until the end of October to take young people's views about education in COVID, rather than, you know, we've moved on from the restart, so it's all about education in COVID. And maybe just to give you a couple of examples, when we did week 1 last week, you young people were delighted to be back at school, to see their friends, great to be back in the classroom. But by the second week, you know, they're getting very afraid again, they're getting worried, they're getting concerned about the exam pressure, about the teaching maybe being done too quickly. So that's all very, very interesting stuff that's coming out of that. But the whole participation model, Laura, I suppose is akin to us in terms of doing youth service and youth work. And it's very exciting to be working with Paul and with June and looking at, you know, our principles of participation and to take that forward, and particularly connected with the Ireland one as well. So thank you very much for that opportunity this morning, but certainly in the Education Authority and Youth Service, we're working very strongly with DE to continue to support and develop the model. Thank you.
Sorry.
Shauna Collinson, a few, and then back to you, Paul.
Okay, no problem.
Thank you. And yeah, Siobhan, I'm from the Education Authority. I'm an Assistant Director in the Education Authority, and Siobhan has highlighted there the work that the Youth Service are doing to engage with young people to get their voice on Education Restart, and now the education through COVID that we're looking at. I think just to say as well that the presentation this morning is really interesting in putting that formal framework around the young person's participation and engagement and their voice across all of our services. I think that the services within the Education Authority, we do, you know, want to listen to the voice of the young people. We want to create the space, and we want to advocate for their voice as well. But I do think that we have a lot of work to do around that formal framework, and having the consistency of that approach on the individual pupil level, as well on the group level, whenever we are considering our policies, our practices, our developments, and the young people who are involved in our service, be that within their own education provision at school and our services and additionality or a support mechanism, or whenever their education is actually fully within one of our services as well. So, you know, I certainly welcome and will be taking back the framework and the presentation that's come across from your Lundy model into some of the work that we are developing, because we certainly have a want to do it. It's certainly happening. Like we've said, everything can always be better, and we need that more consistent framework around it as well. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Shauna.
Could I just add one thing? And I thought it was very, very important what Laura said, and I think Paul would probably agree with me. We have noticed that it's very difficult to get feedback back to young people about what they've told us. But I think what Laura said is really important. I think maybe it is patchy, Paul, and maybe it's a bit tokenistic is what Laura was saying, but I think it is the start of a journey that we're learning that we have to feed back to young people in everything that they tell us about them. We need to tell them how we've used it, how they've impacted and how they've influenced it, because that's certainly sort of the whole ethos of youth work and building relationships with young people and giving them feedback. So I thought that was very interested in Laura's input as well. Thank you.
Can I just say something about education? Because this is where my heart is. My career ended up in participation, but my heart is in education. I wrote the book on education law in Northern Ireland many years ago. In the south of Ireland, when we started in that journey, the Department of Education, who you expect to be the best, were actually not the strongest, you know, in terms of action points. And they've come in the slowest journey in some ways, but where they're at now is really interesting. You know, I mean, I've done work with everybody in education south of Ireland, and now they're using it, you know, to reform the model, to reform their curriculum. We did work with their inspectorate. Their inspectorate have completely changed how they do inspections themselves, but also what they look for in schools when they go to inspect about participation. You know, we have it at strategic, like, so again, that was the start of like starting somewhere. And I remember looking at it and thinking, that's not very much from education, but where they are now, which is, it's probably, well, it's 6 years in really from when they first got their action points together, is in a very different space, and they're learning. And again, they'll say they're not perfect. So I think anything you're doing that you can build on, and I think that's where they find the model useful. It just gives you a structure for thinking through. And I think if you're interested in it, you'll really like the new version, because it's people in the Ministry for Education, it's people in schools, it's social workers, it's early childhood professionals have revamped this checklist to make it work for them.
Sorry, could I just come in there? Laura, as part of our work on the project board that we're taking forward, we have actually invited colleagues from DCYA to actually do a presentation to us during November. We're going to be confirming that over the next few days. We are actually we're going to ask colleagues as well what sort of questions we would like them to answer for us. We understand that in many respects we are quite a bit behind. You said 6 years ago you started working with them. I think that's probably at least how far behind we are. But we are sort of keen to learn, and we're hoping for, you know, that will provide us with information. We understand that they are developing a lot of resources as well. You know, they have a website with a good resources together. So there's a lot of things there for us to look at and learn from. Siobhan mentioned about feedback, and at the end of your presentation, you had that slide with the questions you think that really we should ask. In terms of the feedback, I think that while we've attempted to get feedback for children and young people over the summer, it has been, some people have provided us with more detail than others. Some have obviously thought about how they take on board what's been provided to them better than others. But those questions that you set out there, I think they'll be very useful for us, and to sort of saying to people, this is the sort of standard that we would like to try and get to in terms of providing feedback. We are also working with other colleagues across the Northern Ireland Civil Service on a number of different strategies that are being developed in terms of thinking about co-design with children and young people. June Wilkinson, my immediate boss, has been sort of quite instrumental in that. And that there's working maybe with colleagues in the Department for Communities, looking at things that are quite important in terms of poverty and sort of, you know, sort of gender identity things. So there's work ongoing there as well. So yeah, it's all very interesting. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you. I think I'm on this group, but I've never managed to make it. Is that right, Paul? I've been
yes, I think the last time we invited you, you were presenting to the EU Commission, so you were busy that day.
Terrible. So I'm really excited to work with you on it, and hopefully to bring. And I don't want to keep talking about the south of Ireland. At one point, I know we're nearly finished, but I'll take a question. But it struck me as I've had time to think, and I'm not traveling, which is brilliant. A lot of the work I've done in the last year has been with very small nations. So I've been working with New Zealand, I've been working with Jersey, I've been working with Iceland, I'm working with Andorra at the minute, if you want a really small nation. And we're small, you know, and I feel like what's possible for us, you know, is really, you know, it's incredible what's been possible for us when I see, and I know Iceland is like tiny, and there's only 300,000 people, so about 100,000 children. But I think I mentioned this to John in the past, you know, when they decided to have a summit, instead of worrying about representation, you know, like who would come forward from their local youth council, they just did a random sample of every child in Iceland over the age of 7 or 8 and invited them to Reykjavik, you know, and 40% of them turned up, and every minister turned up, you know, and they got them into groups of interest. And you know, there's ways that there's things we can do that you can't do elsewhere because we're we, you know. And I think that I'm learning a lot as I go and look at these other small places, you know.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the likes of Iceland. It is interesting to hear about that, and I know from other work that we've sort of touched on. I think we've been looking at Planet Youth in terms of sort of for other things, but Iceland I think is where it was initially developed. So yeah, there's a lot of work going on across the world we can always learn from.
I think, you know, professionals and adults, we can maybe feel that it's quite overwhelming, the amount or the level that we need to do, but what we need to get to is realizing that it's building blocks, you know, it's the small kind of pieces of feedback or engagement that then we build and you know, put together and do that alongside the young people as well. And I think that's, you know, it's important for us to always reflect on that and bring that back down to it's the small bits that we connect and those building blocks that we connect up, rather than thinking we're going to be able to kind of respond to or answer all young people's questions and problems about absolutely everything, you know, to do with their education, their health, their society, their climate. You know, it's making sure we've got the connections then across all of those pieces of voice.
Listen, everyone, we've had really useful engagement and discussion over the last just more than an hour, and some useful feedback as well there from Kula and Mairead at the Commission. If we're happy that we've received all the comments and questions, I will hand back to David now for a wrap up, and thanks again to everyone for participating today.
Okay, thanks, Anne, and you know, big thanks to Kula and special thanks to Laura. A wonderful presentation there, very thought-provoking and fantastic actually to see that we've developed something here which is being adopted worldwide. You know, we're a bit slow to celebrate the things we're good at, but this is one of them, and we absolutely should. And to be honest, the best way of celebrating it, I think, is if we adopt it and apply it rigorously and fully. And you know, this is, you could indulge in hyperbole, but this is a unique and unprecedented times, given COVID, Brexit, ongoing austerity and everything else. And there's no doubt we are across the public sector, as public sector leaders, we're having to work at pace. And I fully understand how sometimes it can seem that it's very difficult to find the time to do this type of engagement. But I think the lesson we take from what Laura has said is that if you don't do this properly, you're going to end up with suboptimal outcomes. And I think involving young people at this particularly difficult time is something that we really do need to find time to do, and to do properly, and using Laura's model. And it is an opportune time because the executive, in parallel with this discussion, there are discussions about the next programme for government. The executive is also developing a recovery plan in tandem with that. And we really do have to find the time to make sure that young people's views are properly taken account of, so that we get solutions that work for them and outcomes that work for them. So just to close again, huge thanks to Laura. I don't know if there's any sort of final word you want to give to us just before we close off.
No, just thanks for the opportunity to speak to you. You know, Kula sometimes describes me as Northern Ireland's best kept secret, you know, and it was a bit frustrating, I suppose, sometimes because I'm a home bird, you know, I hate traveling, I do so much of it. So I love COVID for that, not for anything else. And it's nice to actually get connected with many of you, and hopefully, you know, I can be of help at home as well as abroad. So thank you.
Well, Laura, thanks again. You're a little less of a secret than you were an hour and a half ago. So thanks again to you. And thanks to everybody for participating. And I wish you all well with the challenges ahead. So thanks very much.